transport. So you had car-centric cities, you had bike-centric cities, and we see a shift. We see it already, and it will be enforced that cities more and more understand that they need to build cities around the people.
More than 50% of the world's population lives in cities. That's expected to rise to almost 70% by 2050. So pressure for space, gridlocks, and pollution are driving city planners against cars in favor of bike sharing or electric transport. Younger city dwellers especially are embracing new ways to get around. Some 40% of people globally are now open to new forms of travel. But cities need to invest more in new tech, like digital payments and sharing programs.
Hello and welcome back. Thank you, Michael and Liam, for a great discussion. I'm now delighted to bring you the next part of our agenda, which will look at the role of energy in climate change and how we can use finance mobile climate action in two exclusive interviews. First, Katie Daigle, Reuters climate change editor, speaks to Inger Andersen at UNEP. Then Simon Jessen, Reuters correspondent, speaks to Mukhtar Diop, managing director at IFC, who will talk specifically about P3s and blended finance. Over to you, Katie and Inger.
Hi, I'm Katie Daigle. I am the climate environment editor for Reuters, and I am here with Inger Andersen. Inger is a Danish economist and environmentalist. She's the Undersecretary General of the United Nations and the Executive Director of the UN Environment Program. Thank you so much, Inger, for joining us to chat. Of course, this is a very topical issue these days, environmental agendas.
Well, thank you for having me.
Welcome. So about the UN, as an environmental journalist, I often think of the UNEP as the environmental journalist's best friend, because of the great science that and research that the UNEP drives. That said, the organization is now nearly 60 years old, and we are in some of our most difficult times environmentally ever. So I guess, what's the point of the UNEP? I don't mean to be flip, but can you explain to our listeners why the world needs an organization like UNEP now?
Well, first of all, thank you for telling us that we are the best friend of the environmental journalist. That one I'm going to quote you on. But no, look, I mean, obviously, what we do is we provide data and science. We are sort of the environmental conscience of the world, if you like. We bring all this data together, have done for 50 years. We were founded in 1972, and we watch deeper on the horizons for environmental change, and we ring the alarm bells. And we hold the planet and the environment under our watch. And it's under our watch with others, obviously, and with member states, etc., that we have formed a series of multilateral environmental agreements. We've established serious science that looks at whether it's climate, IPCC, whether it's biodiversity, the IPBES, the sort of twin sister for nature, if you like, or whether it's the International Resources Panel or the Chemicals Outlook. We establish a number of partnerships, etc. But at the end of the day, what we can do is to hold up the evidence, the data, the science. Then it's, you know, we can't force the hand of governments. That's where media, voters, you know, the sort of broad-based understanding and political decisions lie. And some have been successful, and others, it's more a question of repeating and repeating. But we also try to inspire change, right? We're very engaged with youth. And we are very much working within the rest of the UN system, seeking to, and not seeking, enabling that the rest of the UN system, depending on their mandate, also owns the environmental agenda. So that goes for agriculture, but it goes for children, UNICEF, it goes for, you know, development, UNDP, and it goes for obviously health, where we work a lot with WHO, etc. So that's sort of who we are. The agreements that countries have agreed to, we know the climate agreement, of course, but we also know a series of agreements around biodiversity, not least the Biodiversity Convention. We know a series of agreements around chemicals, not least the Montreal Protocol, but also others. A series of agreements around endangered species, not least the CITES, which deals with trade in illegal and legal in species. A series of agreements around regional seas, some working well, others with real challenges. So that's who we are. And we try to publish a lot. And I'm really happy that you think that we are useful to the environmental journalism, because we try to make our knowledge and science available to a broad spectrum of the world.
Well, science, and I often say scientists and journalists are similar in that we are both seeking a truth based on evidence. That said, you're of course not a scientist. Your background is very broad. You've led sustainable development at the World Bank Group. You've also been with the International Consortium for the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. So you've kind of seen the full spectrum. How does that background help you with the UNEP's agenda today?
So throughout my own journey, I've had the pleasure of working on sort of front line of poverty and development meets environment and what happens there. Because we need to understand that whilst in the wealthier countries, there may be the resource space to sort of deal with some of these environmental issues, and yet there may not be as much willingness to do so. But on the other side, actually living with a dwindling environmental asset base, if you like, is contributing to poverty. If we look at land and the productivity of land, and when that is lost because of deforestation, because of overchemical use, because of droughts that is induced by climate change, people get poorer. So understanding that a healthy, vibrant, sustainable environment is part and parcel of the poverty solution, and of dealing with and addressing and lifting the millions who live in abject poverty out of that. So getting at sustainable development, I've sort of lived that my entire working life in a variety of settings at UNDP, the United Nations, at the World Bank, in the NGO world with IUCN, and now with UNEP. And I've come to the conclusion that unless we deal with these three planetary crises, the climate crisis, the biodiversity and nature crisis, and the pollution and waste crisis, which is driven by our unsustainable consumption and production, we are not going to reach where we all aspire to, no poverty, no hunger, girls in school, healthy economies, good growth, and opportunities and equality for all, etc. So getting at that and understanding the very fundamental elements of what the planet needs to be able to offer to us and to future generations, to me, is absolutely key. So that's what we try to do, and certainly what I have sought to do.
On that topic, you've said in the past that you see the finance industry, the financial industry, investors, businesses, as a key part of the solution, both in terms of conservation and a healthy environment and climate change. Can you explain a little what that looks like? What specifically can the finance sector do to actually make a difference, a real difference?
Well, I think let's begin by understanding that these masses of funds that sits in banks and investments, etc., that yield the interest, maybe for your pension, maybe for mine, maybe for companies' investment, etc., that are traded on the stock exchanges, etc. Where do they go? And are they really directed to where it is the interest of the average shareholder that they do go, including you and me, A young person that enters a public or private pension scheme at age 20 would like to be able to draw her pension at age 85. So where is it that that money goes? Is it in long-term sustainability, or is it in some short-term gain? Because look, we can cut the proverbial forest empty and have a great quarterly return, if you like. We can fish the proverbial oceans empty and have a great quarterly return. But we need to think about the long term. So getting the finance industry to lean in on this is critical, because that is, after all, where the economies move. And so the more shareholders lean in and understand the longer term dimensions of this, the more government guardrails and policies are there to enable that we're sort of driving in the right direction, including no more financing of coal, including some of these clear guardrails that we need to have on biodiversity, we need to have on pollution and chemicals and waste, and certainly on energy and carbon emitting sectors. Well, that has to be part of the solution, because if we're just talking inside a happy environment bubble, meanwhile, the economy is driving us into the ditch, that is not going to work. So I don't want to be naive about this, because there are very strong economic interests behind some of these industries that I refer to. But there are also intergenerational justice interests. There are also voters' interests. There are also public goods interests. And it's about enabling, and there are good investors too, let me hasten to add, and good pension funds that are doing the right thing. So it's also about enabling that conversation to enable policy guardrails, as I said, but also the industry itself leaning in. And if we think about the kind of commitments that we've made, the kind of understanding that we now see, for example, we launched this year the UN Decade for Ecosystem Restoration. Look, we have hundreds of billions of hectares of land that are lying degraded. And meanwhile, we're busy degrading virgin lands or virgin forests. Well, what about if we were to put the degraded landscapes back into working landscapes so that we can protect what is still pristine? That surely is good for nature. It's good for industry, it's good for the investor, and it is very good for the local communities that live there. So I think whether it's pulp and paper or whether it's a farmer in the Sahel, each one has an opportunity. The more we can enable that funding is available for long-term returns. And we at UNEP, we've worked with and established some 15 more years ago, the UNEP Financial Initiative, which now has more than 400 banks, insurers, and investors. They have signed up to the UN Principles for Responsible Banking. 200 banks have done so. We are holding them to account, feet to the fire a little bit, and they have to publish what they're investing in and how they're moving their investment portfolio. We've worked with the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, which now today have 46 members managing $6.7 trillion. And the Net Zero Banking Alliance, 55 banks, 28 countries, over 37 trillion, that have signed up to move their assets into net zero. So is it fast enough? No. Do we want it faster? Yes. Is there a danger that this could become sort of greenwashing? Yes, but that's why we are in there, to engage and to hold to account and to be transparent about it. And I think that this is part of why we must engage with financing. We must engage with industry. That's the only way that we can shift what needs to be shifted towards a sustainable future.
Now, of course, there are so many to-dos, so to speak, or things that we are hoping to get out of climate negotiations globally. We have the UN Climate Conference coming up in just a few weeks in Glasgow, Scotland. How far, the agenda you lay out for the finance industry, how far along are we to where we need to be, in your opinion, and how likely is Glasgow to deliver what we need? I'm trying to understand realistically what we might expect from this conference.
Look, on the financing, we are beginning a journey, And I will be pressing the fast forward button at every step of the way, because we are now hitting COP26. That is 27 years, because we skipped the beat, right? 27, it's more than a quarter of a century. It's completely unacceptable to me. I've been around too long and in too many of the early COPs, and it's completely unacceptable that it's 27 years. But here we are. And there is a beginning, there is a global conversation of, I mean, we heard in the Youth Summit just the other day, you know, the young people are fed up of blah, blah, blah. You know, they want to see action, and I salute that, I really do. And so I think that what we agreed in Paris was that we would meet 5 years later, that's now 6 because of the pandemic, and that we would come with a stretched promise, what is referred to as the national determined contributions, that we would, whatever we promised in Paris, now we're going to stretch it even more. And that's what needs to be delivered. Now, we saw the adding up of that stretch not being good enough. We saw that in the report that the the Climate Change Convention Secretariat released just a week ago. But we also understand that inside that promise, there is the conditional promises, i.e., okay, if you give us the funding, we can stretch even more, said a good number of countries. So back in Copenhagen, back in COP15, we said by 2020, there shall be 100 billion on the table every year for climate finance from public and private sources. We're not there. So that has to be delivered in Glasgow. The stretched NDCs has to be delivered in Glasgow. And we need to understand that the G20 is responsible for 78% of all carbon emissions, 78%. So the big to-do items, yes, it's wonderful that Gambia is coming with an NDC, and we salute that, or that the small island development states are coming with their commitments. But these 20 countries have a real to-do item, and they have to stretch, because without that stretch, we're not going to get there. And talking is not going to do it. So what am I expecting? The optimistic me wish to see the financing in place so that the conditional elements on the NDCs can be delivered. And remember that the Paris Accord says that adaptation and mitigation finance should be in a degree of balance. It doesn't say dollar for dollar, but it should be in a degree of balance, because poorer countries are going to get hit hard and need to have the adaptation finance in place. So I hope that we will see that, but I also expect that G20 countries, live up to their absolute obligation to deliver on this stretch. And there's some easy win like methane. Let's just deal with that, get it out. It'll just buy down our global emissions load very quickly. And then there are other elements that are a little harder, but all of it had to get done. We need to not only declare that we're going to go net zero at some point in the future, we need to start in 2021 with step 1, 2, 3, and 5 on the net zero path. Don't kick the can down the road, because that's too late. So that's what I expect, and I will hold everyone to the fire as best I can.
I think the youth activists will too.
Yeah.
That's of course what we expect from governments, but from the business sector, is there something we should be watching in Glasgow, and what would be the single most important thing you think that the investor or business class could deliver?
I think the Net Zero Alliance, the Net Zero Asset Owners, and the Net Zero Banking Alliance is interesting to watch, because there you actually have, it's Mark Carney and others who were really well respected in the financial world, who have led 2 central banks, as we well know, starting in Canada and then in the UK, and who actually, and many others, I hasten to add, who are sort of leaning in and seeing that the long-term resilience of the finance system and of countries will depend on their ability to switch, right? Their ability to shift. So I think we need to watch that space of the financing, but we also need to watch cities and mayors, because they are, they are living the climate change right now. I mean, from Bangladesh to New York City, right? This is real, and mayors are seeing it up close and personal, and they are responsible directly to their citizens. There's nothing in between them. They get elected normally by the constituency directly, and so they have to, on the one hand, deal with adaptation, but also the move, because the big climate emitters are the cities. So I think that's another space to watch. And of course, there within cities, it's about transport. At times that is, it's about the building industry. It's about the heating and cooling industry. And there are some very exciting things happening in that space, in the cooling industry, as well as in the heating industry. Too slow in the building industry, where we need the weight of cities, the carbon weight of cities in terms of just how we build, how we construct, how we tear down and never use materials again. So getting circularity into the building industry and into broader consumption and production will be critical. Ditto for textiles, where we're seeing some moves for circularity, but not fast enough. So I think that these are some of the sectors that we should be looking at.
I want to ask about the price of carbon. A lot of anxiety has gone into discussions around what the price of carbon should be. And I'm wondering, at least for UNEP and your operations, your priorities, your agenda, whether this is an important aspect going forward and how so.
It is an important aspect. It's important that we get to an agreement around Article 6, right? I mean, that matters. And for the uninitiated and without getting lost in the many details, that's kind of the place where the carbon pricing story will be set. There's much more to it than that. But not having gotten there in the rule book is critical. So now you have these localized markers in the EU and here and there in China, and that is good, but it's not good enough. And you need to be sure that this is not leaking and that it is real and that the carbon markets actually function. And so getting Article 6 in place, right now, carbon is way too cheap, right? I mean, it's ridiculous. And so that means that, it's not really that bad to pollute. I mean, if you have to offset because the prices are fairly cheap. And if we get a global market and if it gets going and if it has watchdog oversight and cannot be fudged, let's be honest, it could be an important lever together with many other elements, right? Driving the net zero, getting the policies in place, et cetera, et cetera. It has been hard to get there. We hope that we would get there sooner. But at this point, the science is so unequivocal. We at UNEP have been coming out with science every year on the year for eons with ever greater precision about what will happen if we don't take action. And this year, we didn't really need graphs to accompany it because the accompanying was on the TV screens. We did the TV screens and the newspaper headlines. So getting carbon right is critical, but we also just simply need to take the step into the net zero world, into getting our subsidy regime right, which means obviously no subsidies to hydrocarbons, and into getting clarity around coal and other phase outs on hydrocarbons, and into, yes, subsidizing where needed renewables until such time that they can be enabled more broadly, and subsidizing through 100 billion a year to enable countries that otherwise would go for a cheaper option that might be hydrocarbon based, that they can afford to make that extra stretch as they expand their energy network.
We've talked a lot about climate change and the climate agenda, or the debate at least. But of course, there's another big conference coming up, the UN Biodiversity Conference, just next week. And this is sort of like the kid sister or the kid brother of the climate conference, the one that not as many people have heard of. Is there a danger in diluting the message or the agenda by having them both so close together, or is that part of the strategy?
So these are two conventions, they're sister conventions established in Rio in 1992. One dealing with biodiversity or nature, the wealth of life on Earth as we know it, and one dealing with climate. Interestingly, in 1992, more people knew about biodiversity, but because it's harder to see the loss of it than the climate that sucks it at us with ever greater intensity, more people have become concerned, and rightly so, on the climate side. And on biodiversity, it's more of a whether you are interested here. But let me leave this absolutely clear. Loss of biodiversity means loss of the planet's ability to sustain us. Biodiversity gives us the rain we get, the water we drink, the food we eat, the air we breathe. It circulates everything. The miracle of photosynthesis is what we rely on. And each plant or animal or insect is dependent upon another. It eats one place, nests in another, migrates to a third. And when you lose species, and we are set to lose 1 million species out of the 7.8 or so that we have on the planet, if we continue down the current track, if you take out these things, the ecosystem can't continue. And also, so the drivers of biodiversity loss, yes, climate change is a driver, but not the primary driver right now. It is our conversion of the land, right? We've modified 77% of the ice-free land, done cities, highways, agriculture, etc. We've modified 87% of our oceans by human activity. And we've made all of these changes and then assumed that the fields would be pollinated, that things would be cycled, that the hydrological cycle would work perfectly, etc. Well, we can't expect that. And so we absolutely must take care of the climate, but we need to understand that nature, biodiversity, the ecosystems are just as critical. And so, yes, COP15 for biodiversity is coming up, and we are doing it in a 1-2 punch because of the pandemic. So as you rightly say, next week will be more of the sort of the budget and more of the sort of procedural issues. And at the time when we will be able to bring the world together, we will have the full COP that will deal with some of these resolutions. And like COP21, which was when we got the big Paris Agreement push, we are set to take a big push on biodiversity, agreeing on new targets. And these targets will deal with the drivers of loss, the conversion and the transformation of lands that we have done, will deal with the driver of loss, of course, of pollution, will deal with the driver of loss of overexploitation, i.e. cutting too much or taking too many fish or whatever it is. So it will deal also with the loss of species that we have overexploited. I think I mentioned that. So, and setting targets around that, and then holding, just like we're doing now in climate, business and everyone and cities and ourselves to account in our consumption patterns. So yes, it is a big one. It is
no small task.
It's very important.
Inger, thank you so much for joining us today. I think we are at time, but good luck and at both of the conferences coming up. I assume you'll be there. And
thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the next session at today's Reuters Impact Conference. My name is Simon Jessup, Chief Correspondent Sustainable Finance at Reuters. It gives me great pleasure to welcome my guest for today, Maktar Diop, Managing Director at the IFC, for a fireside chat about mobilizing climate action through public-private partnerships and blended finance. Maktar, it's great to have you here today.
Thank you so much, Simon. It's great to join you today.
Thank you. Claire, before we get into the weeds on some of this, we're heading into COP26, the big round of global climate talks, pretty big event. I'd love to just ask you straight up at the start, what does success look like, do you think, for the conference coming up? And what would you like to see governments come up with?
Thanks so much, Simon. Let me first say that climate change is making a landfall, but it's also the greatest commercial opportunity for all of us today. It allows us, certainly, if you do the thing rightly, to invest in the climate economy and to really transform this world. What is exciting is not only people of my generation, but the younger generation is telling us that there is no option except to change the situation in which we are living. So what I would like to see at COP26 is all of us to work together, to have the financial market, the policymakers, the business world work in unison and make this increase of investment. We need to have much more investment for the private sector in climate change. We are just at the tip, hitting the tip of the iceberg by just mobilizing a little bit of the large amount of money which can be mobilized today. But for that, we need to do a few things. We need to make sure that the financial system is green. So that's a priority in IFC right now, to help green the financial sector. We need to think about the regulation, which helps doing that better and faster. We need to help countries which are developing their national development contribution to have the right set of policy. And by doing that, we think that the $1 trillion that are sitting now in the global financial market could be used by institutional investors and asset managers to be invested in the green economy. But to do that, they need to see something new coming before them. So innovation will be central. And we are spending at IFC a lot of time in thinking about new instruments that will be much more attractive to the private sector and to institutional investors.
Great, thank you. And hopefully we'll get into that a bit more in a second.